The silver bracelet. A mother's unexpected legacy. I was clearing out my mother's small apartment in the retirement community when I found it. A delicate silver bracelet I'd never seen before, nestled in a velvet pouch at the back of her jewelry drawer. Unlike her other pieces, which were mostly practical and unassuming, this was exquisitely crafted, with intricate Celtic knots and tiny amethyst stones catching the afternoon light. As I turned it over in my palm, I noticed an inscription inside. To Helen, who taught me to see the stars. Love always, J. J? My father's name was Robert. They had been married for 52 years before his death 8 years ago. In all that time, I'd never heard my mother mention anyone significant named J. At 73, I thought I knew everything about Helen Carson. Her childhood in rural Minnesota, her career as a high school librarian, her devotion to my father, her quiet passion for astronomy that had inspired my own career as an astrophysicist. Yet here was evidence of someone I'd never heard of, someone who had obviously mattered enough to give her such a personal gift. I slipped the bracelet into my pocket, finished packing the last of her belongings, and locked the apartment door for the final time. Mom had passed away peacefully 3 weeks earlier at 89, leaving behind 2 children, 5 grandchildren. And apparently, at least one secret. Back at my own home, I called my brother Thomas. Did Mom ever mention someone whose name began with J? Someone from before Dad? There was a thoughtful pause on the line. Not that I recall. Why? I described the bracelet, the inscription. Interesting, he said. You know, she did have that box of old photographs she never let anyone look through. Maybe there's something there. The box in question was already sitting on my dining room table. A weathered floral hat box filled with photographs Mom had always kept in her bedroom closet. As children, Thomas and I had been firmly but kindly told it contained grown-up memories that weren't for sharing. As adults, we'd respected her privacy enough never to press the issue. I opened it now, feeling like an intruder in my mother's past, even though she was gone. Inside were dozens of black and white photographs, mostly from the late 1940s and early 1950s, judging by the clothing styles and the cars visible in some shots. I began sorting through them methodically. Most were unsurprising. Mom with her parents and sisters, Mom in her college graduation gown, Mom with groups of young women who must have been friends or roommates. But then I found one that made me pause. It showed my mother, looking impossibly young and carefree, sitting on a picnic blanket beside a handsome young man with dark, wavy hair. They were leaning slightly toward each other, both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. On the back, written in my mother's neat handwriting, Lake Michigan with Jack, August 1953. Jack. J. I continued through the photographs and found several more of them together at what appeared to be a dance, walking along a lakeshore. Standing before an observatory dome. In each one, they looked blissfully happy, with the unmistakable glow of young people in love. The final photograph showed Jack in an army uniform, looking serious but with a slight smile. On the back, Jack's deployment photo, March 1954. Deployment. The Korean War had ended in 1953, but American troops had remained. Had Jack been sent overseas? And what had happened to him? My mother had met my father in 1955 and married him in 1956. Had she and Jack simply drifted apart, or was there more to the story? At the bottom of the box, I found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to Miss Helen Larson at her parents' address in Minnesota, all from Lieutenant John Adler with an Army Post Office return address. With a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, I untied the ribbon and opened the first one, dated April 1954. My dearest Helen, Korea is beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The mountains remind me of the time we drove up to Lake Superior last fall. Do you remember how the fog rolled in so suddenly, We could barely see the road. Here, too, the mist transforms familiar landscapes into something otherworldly. But unlike that weekend, there is no warmth of your hand in mine as we navigate the uncertainty. I think often of our night at the Adler Planetarium, my namesake as you always teased. How you pointed out constellations I'd never noticed before. How you explained that the light we were seeing had traveled for years, centuries even, to reach our eyes. We're looking back in time, you said. Sometimes I feel that way about us, that our time together exists as starlight, traveling across distance, something that will remain visible long after its source has changed or even disappeared. Forgive my philosophizing. Sleep is scarce here, and when I do close my eyes, I see your face. Write to me about ordinary things, your classes, your family, the books you're reading. Help me remember the world we'll return to when this is over. All my love, Jack. My mother's relationship with my father had been loving, but reserved. They rarely displayed physical affection. And their conversations had tended toward the practical rather than the poetic. This letter revealed a Helen Larson I'd never known, one who inspired passionate prose, who shared her love of astronomy with a young man whose words suggested both intelligence and deep feeling. The subsequent letters chronicled 8 months of separation, Jack writing from various locations in Korea, his letters growing increasingly hopeful as his tour of duty neared its end. He wrote of their future plans, graduate school for both of them, marriage, a home near a university where they could pursue their studies. Then came a gap of several months, followed by a letter postmarked from Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., dated January 1955. Helen, I'm finally allowed to write, though I'm not sure if you'll want to hear from me after my last letter. The doctors say I'm lucky. The shrapnel missed my vital organs. And with time and physical therapy, I should recover most of my mobility. But I wanted to reiterate what I wrote before. I release you from any obligation to me. My rehabilitation will be lengthy, my future uncertain. You're just beginning your graduate studies, with your whole life ahead of you. I love you too much to become your burden. I meant what I said about the stars, Helen. Some lights are meant to be admired from a distance, their beauty unchanged by time or space. Perhaps that's what we are to each other now. Forever yours, even as I set you free. Jack. I searched the box for the letter he referenced, but it wasn't there. Whatever he had written to release my mother from their relationship was missing, kept separately perhaps, or destroyed. At the very bottom of the box, I found a newspaper clipping from 1973, nearly 20 years later. It was an obituary for Dr. John Adler, 43, professor of astronomy at the University of Chicago and research fellow at the Adler Planetarium, who had passed away after a long illness. He was survived by colleagues and students who remembered him as a brilliant mind and dedicated mentor, who, despite physical challenges resulting from military service, contributed significantly to our understanding of stellar evolution. He had never married. I sat back, the bracelet heavy in my hand, trying to comprehend what these discoveries meant about my mother's life. She had loved a man named Jack, deeply enough to keep his letters and photographs for over 60 years. He had been injured in Korea, and had released her from their relationship. She had met and married my father less than a year later, and somehow, in 1973, she had reconnected with Jack enough to receive this bracelet, perhaps as a final gift before his death. Had they maintained contact all those years? Had they met again by chance? I would never know. My mother had been a private person, not given to sharing her innermost feelings, but she had been a good mother, attentive, supportive, present. Her marriage to my father had been solid, their partnership one of mutual respect and shared purpose. She had never seemed to be pining for a lost love or living a life of regret. Yet she had kept these mementos, preserved this part of her history, hidden from everyone, but accessible enough that she must have revisited these memories from time to time. "Mom?" My daughter Rachel's voice startled me from my reflections. She had let herself in with her key, finding me surrounded by the photographs and letters. "I brought dinner," she said, setting down a bag of takeout. "Thought you might not feel like cooking while you're going through Grandma's things." She glanced at the papers spread across the table. "What's all this?" I hesitated only briefly before showing her the bracelet, explaining what I'd discovered. "So Grandma had a first love who went to war," Rachel said thoughtfully, examining the silver bracelet. "And they somehow reconnected years later?" "It seems so," I agreed, "though I don't know how or when. She never mentioned him." Rachel smiled. "It makes her more interesting, doesn't it? More dimensional." I nodded, struck by the truth of this observation. My pragmatic, reserved mother had contained depths I'd never glimpsed, passions and sorrows she'd carried quietly throughout her life. "Do you think she ever told Grandpa about him?" Rachel asked. "I don't know," I admitted. Dad wasn't the jealous type, but they both came from a generation that didn't discuss previous relationships much. I paused, considering. Though I remember once, when I was about 12, asking Mom why she became interested in astronomy. She said something about someone special showing her the stars when she was young. I assumed she meant her father, but it must have been Jack, Rachel finished, her first love. That night, after Rachel left, I took the bracelet and the photograph of my mother and Jack by the lake out to my back porch. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead. I thought about light traveling across time and space, about lives connecting and diverging, about the parts of ourselves we share and the parts we keep private. My mother had loved two men in her life, one briefly but intensely in her youth, one steadily and enduringly through marriage, parenthood, and into old age. Neither love diminished the other. Both had shaped her into the woman I knew and loved. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, feeling its weight, the tangible evidence of a relationship that had continued to matter, even after circumstances had forced its transformation. My mother had chosen to keep this part of herself private, but she had also chosen to preserve it in a way that I would eventually discover. A gift, perhaps, a reminder that we are all more complicated than we appear, that a life well lived contains both what is visible and what is hidden, that love endures in many forms. As I gazed up at the night sky my mother had taught me to love, I felt I was finally seeing her completely, not just as my mother, but as Helen, who had once taught a young soldier to see the stars.